What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. Today I want to talk to you about X-Men Fatal Attractions. This is an X-Men crossover from, I want to say 1993. This is a crossover story, sort of, between books like X-Force, X-Factor, Excalibur, and then really it's just contained within X-Men and Uncanny X-Men. And I like this a lot more than I thought I would, because a lot of the big crossover stories, they usually are kind of messy, and they're a little rough. I liked this, but there are some things about it that I think could have been done better. So first, let me talk about the things that I like about this story. I like that it's not a gigantic, sprawling mess of a story that has to balance like 100 characters in a relatively short amount of time. You look at something like the Executioner song, which came shortly before this, and you had X-Force, X-Factor, X-Men, and Uncanny X-Men, and all of the characters that are featured in each of those series are in the story of the Executioner song. And that is a lot of characters to balance in such a short amount of time. I think it was like 3 issues for each of those series. So that's like 12 issues, and you have over 20 characters who are featured in that story, and not every character is going to get to play a part in that story. And so they feel like they're just kind of hanging out there, not really playing a part in the story. And for me, whenever I watch a movie or read a book or read a comic book, I want to feel like every character has something to contribute to the story. And what I like about Fatal Attractions is it's not really a gigantic crossover between all of these books. We start off, there's a few issues that aren't actually part of the Fatal Attraction story. In this particular printing, these issues are just leading up to it. We're getting to see kind of what the status quo is with the Acolytes and Fabian Cortez. If you read the tail end of Chris Claremont's run on the X-Men, whenever Jim Lee was really kicking it off with Adjectiveless X-Men, Fabian Cortez, he believed that he had killed Magneto, and we're getting to see some of the aftermath of that here. We get to see some stuff with the Upstarts. I don't particularly care for the subplot of the Upstarts. That was Trevor Fitzroy, Shinobi Shaw, and Fabian Cortez, all characters that I don't find to be that interesting. Fabian Cortez is okay, but I really didn't like the whole Upstarts thing, but we get to see a little bit of that, and then when we actually get into the Fatal Attraction storyline, we start with an issue of X-Factor, and it's pretty much just a self-contained story. We really focus on Quicksilver and his relationship with his father, and then he's kind of divided because he gets to see these people who profess to be followers of Magneto doing some really horrible stuff. They're killing people who are in a hospital and cannot defend themselves. But then he also gets to see the American government building Sentinels, and he doesn't really like that, but he sees that maybe this is a good thing. If you've got people like the Acolytes, and if Magneto is still alive, then maybe the government needs a way to protect themselves from Magneto, who has done some horrible things, and his followers are still doing some horrible things. And I really like that. I wasn't expecting something quite so introspective in this big giant X-Men crossover, which this isn't really like I thought it would be. It's not like Executioner song, or even right after this we had a crossover with the Avengers called Blood Ties, which was also a big huge mess that had a whole bunch of characters it was trying to balance. So I like that you have this issue of X-Factor, and it's leading up to Magneto coming back, and it's got the through line of the Acolytes, which is present throughout this entire book, but you don't really see much of X-Factor after that issue. They show up, spoilers, but Illyana Rasputin dies right before the Fatal Attraction storyline happens, and at her funeral, that's kind of where the plot really kicks off for the crossover part of this story. But X-Factor, they show up at Illyana's funeral, but they're not an intrinsic part of this entire storyline. The same with X-Force. We get to see X-Force find out that Magneto is still alive, and that is kind of tied in with a lot of stuff that was going on with X-Force at this time. Cable had just recently been believed to be dead, and then we find out that he's back, and he had his own stuff going on in his ongoing series, and then he gets reacquainted with X-Force, and then almost immediately he realizes that his satellite, Graymalkin, has now been appropriated by Magneto, and he has changed its name to Avalon, and he is basically coming down to Earth and then recruiting mutants to live in heaven away from humankind. And Cable, he doesn't like this because A, he feels feels like Graymalkin is the last bit of his past that he has, because if you were reading the Cable ongoing series, Cable destroyed the time machine, so he's no longer able to go back to his future. And so he feels like that's all that he has left, and he doesn't like that someone dangerous like Magneto now has that. So he goes up there to get the Professor computer program, which, long story short, this is a program that once belonged in SHIP, which was a celestial ship that Apocalypse had in the X-Factor comic. I won't get into all of that. But he goes up there to rescue this program, and then he also wants to self-destruct the satellite. Magneto messes with his techno-organic bits and then sends him back down, or maybe Cable escapes, I don't remember. But again, this is kind of a character piece. We get to focus on Cable a little bit, and he has to come to the realization that Graymalkin, the satellite, is just a physical thing. It doesn't matter as much as his legacy in X-Force that he still has. The members of X-Force are still alive. And I also like that this is not completely forgetting that Magneto does have a little bit of a connection with the X-Men. He tries to recruit Sunspot and Cannonball into his new followers because he taught them whenever he was a headmaster at... I'm talking about Magneto here, sorry. Because he taught them when he was the headmaster at Xavier's school. And Cannonball even says, you know, I am the man I am today because of your teachings and Charles Xavier's teachings. And it doesn't quite go the way Magneto wanted it to, but I like that interplay between these two. And really, my biggest gripe about this is the way Magneto is handled so inconsistently throughout this book. And there are a few different people who are telling these stories. Fabian Nicieza, Scott Lobdell, there's a few others. I guess I could go ahead and pop open the table of contents, but we've got, let's see here, Larry Hama and Joe Quesada, J.M. DeMatteis, and then we've got a whole bunch of pencilers and inkers. I'm just going to see if I can show you guys the table of contents here so that I don't have to try and, pause the video there, see if you can look at all the people who contributed the art. Overall, I think the art is pretty good. There's a whole lot of that Image comic style that's going on here, because this was just right after people like Rob Liefeld, Todd McFarlane, Eric Larson, Mark Silvestri, right after all those guys left Marvel Comics to form Image. So that style was still huge at this time, because books like Spawn and Young Blood were selling a bazillion copies each. So even the editorial at Marvel was saying, yeah, that style is still really good. So you had a lot of artists who maybe they wanted to go in the footsteps of those guys, or maybe they were kind of encouraged, hey, draw more like Jim Lee, draw more like Todd McFarlane. Specifically, I'm thinking of Brandon Peterson. He has some issues here that look a lot like Jim Lee. Greg Capullo was doing X-Force at this time. His style, very similar to kind of Todd McFarlane a little bit, and then he went on to kind of get a name doing Spawn, and then much later doing Batman in the New 52. By then, I feel like his style had evolved a little bit more, but you can still see a little bit of Todd McFarlane there. But anyway, the biggest complaint I have here is how Magneto is handled so differently from issue to issue. There's the X-Force issue where Magneto says, hey, I just want my former students to be here with me. I like you guys, I taught you guys, and I don't want you guys to die on Earth. And Cannonball and him, they have some good moments there. But then you get to the issue where the X-Men are trying to have the funeral of Illyana Rasputin. And Magneto comes in, and I was a little disappointed that he doesn't acknowledge that Illyana was also his student. She died after Magneto was no longer the headmaster, but he did teach her. She was also one of his students, and we don't even get a moment where Magneto says to Colossus, look, I am really sorry that she died. Maybe, have a single tear go down Magneto's face, something like that. Instead, Magneto comes in and says, well, I know you guys are having a funeral, but this would be a really good time for me to have a recruitment drive. Do any of you want to come and live with me on my space station? This just seems really tacky, and I get that some people have a different view of Magneto than what I have. Personally, I see him more as an anti-hero. He has a very good reason for doing what he's doing. You look at someone like Dr. Doom, he doesn't necessarily have a good reason for wanting to take over the world and wanting to kill the Fantastic Four. Basically, he just wants to prove that he's smarter than Reed Richards. That's a selfish motivation. You have someone like Magneto, he has a very good reason for doing what he's doing. The problem is, some people see him as a straight-up villain. And if you look at the Silver Age X-Men comics, he acts like a Silver Age villain. He acts very much like a straight-up mustache-twirling bad guy. But then you look at the post-1980 Chris Claremont, John Byrne X-Men comics, even after John Byrne, Magneto was given more of a characterization. He was given a more deep personality that wasn't just, waha, I am evil. And a lot of people want to take him back to that. They want to take him to just him screaming his head off at the X-Men and throwing buses at them and stuff. And that's kind of what he's acting like here at the funeral. He just shows up and then immediately he uses his magnetic powers to freeze all of the X-Men. I don't really know how that works. Someone said it's all the metal molecules in their body, but he's never been able to do that before, except someone like Colossus or Cable or Wolverine, who has significant amounts of metal on them. But someone like Storm or Cyclops, he shouldn't be able to freeze them where they are, but he does here. And anyway, Magneto is just kind of acting really megalomaniacal. I don't know if I said that word correctly. It doesn't matter. But he even talks about, like, everyone on this planet is going to die very soon. And he's acting like he is recruiting the people who he feels like are necessary to live on Avalon. And then everyone else is going to die in some scheme that Magneto has. We've seen these schemes before, like when he tried to tilt the Earth on its axis. I want to say that was X-Men issue 150. We've seen that happen before. And it feels like Magneto has something like that planned, and that's why the X-Men are acting so hostile. If Magneto was just coming down and saying, look, I don't want anything to do with humanity. All I want is for any mutant who's interested to come and live with me in heaven, and then I'm not going to be a supervillain anymore. I just want to live up there and have a nice mutant society with no humans at all. If that's what he was doing, I feel like a lot of the X-Men would be okay with that, because the last time that they tangoed with him was pretty much his return to villainy. That was at the tail end of Chris Claremont's run, whenever Jim Lee was starting Adjectiveless X-Men, the second X-Men series. And before that, Magneto had been an ally to the X-Men. He had been a headmaster of the Xavier Institute for like 5 years. So they still have a tenuous connection with him. Rogue, she has a very personal connection with him. Charles, obviously. So I feel like if Magneto just came in with an olive branch and said, I'm not here as a bad guy, I just want to take anyone who's willing to get away from the garbage that is humanity and go live on Avalon. I feel like that would be fine. And it would kind of be an interesting take on a villain who has tried being a villain for so often, and he sees that this doesn't work. Every time he tries something, either the X-Men stop him or he realizes, hey, maybe I can try doing what they're doing, like whenever he was the headmaster of the school. The problem is that would not be a very interesting superhero comic. They have to have some kind of conflict here in order for the X-Men and the governments of the world to be hostile towards Magneto, and then he has to be hostile back. There's expected to be a fair amount of punching in a superhero comic, and if Magneto was not being a bad guy, then this would be kind of boring. It would be interesting seeing him kind of step away from being an ally to the X-Men, but also stepping away from being the adversary to the X-Men that he was before, but it wouldn't make for a very exciting superhero comic. So they have to have him act like a bad guy. And so he's very vaguely talking about how everyone on this planet is going to die, so this is your last chance to come with me to Avalon. But then in other issues, it kind of ignores that. Everyone, all the governments of the world, Russia, America, and I feel like there's some others, they erect this gigantic magnetic field that basically is going to keep Magneto away from Earth. And he's on Avalon, and he says, well, this is unacceptable. I can't go down there and recruit mutants. And he interprets this as a very hostile attack. They put this up as a defensive measure against him. So it's not like Nick Fury was over here saying, we've got to blast that satellite out of the sky. We can't trust that guy up there. He's going to kill us all, which he was threatening to do in the Illyana funeral issue. So they do this, and then he sends out a huge EMP across the entire planet, basically disabling the shield. I don't know how he does this. Again, he is much more powerful in this book than he was before. It's not really explained because Fabian Cortez, he does have the power to amp up someone else's power, but he's not allied with Magneto at this time, and it's been a little while since these two have been in the same room together, and they don't give that as the reason why Magneto is so powerful, but that's neither here nor there. Magneto doing this, it ends up killing a lot of people. Professor Xavier says he could have killed as much as 1,000 people. Airplanes that were in the air, people who were on life support in hospitals, people who were in cars and got in car accidents. A lot of people died when Magneto sent out this EMP thing. And so, I should have mentioned, this book is notable for two things. One, Colossus finally says, I'm done with the X-Men. I want to go and join Magneto. And poor Colossus was going through a lot at this time. In the storyline that was collected just a few years ago called A Skinning of Souls, his parents were both murdered, and then his brother, Mikhail, he actually died shortly before this, and then his sister dies right before the Fatal Attraction storyline. You actually get to see it happen in this book, but it's right before the official Fatal Attractions book starts. And poor Colossus, that's all I can say. I can kind of see why he wants to get away from the life of the X-Men, because he kind of rightly thinks that if I never joined the X-Men, a lot of this stuff would not have happened. His parents dying definitely wouldn't have happened. Illyana, she would not have been kidnapped by, what's-his-face, Arcade, and then aged into adulthood, and then become a satanic princess, and then turned back into a child and contracting the legacy virus. She probably wouldn't have had the legacy virus because she's too young to actually be a mutant at this point. And so if Colossus had never joined the X-Men, she wouldn't have gotten a legacy virus. His brother, I don't know, because his brother was believed to be dead when Colossus joined the X-Men, so I don't know about that. But anyway, there's a lot of stuff that Colossus can rightly lay at the feet of Charles Xavier and the X-Men as a whole. Poor Colossus didn't even get to stay with his sister while she was dying. He had to go and do something else with the rest of the X-Men. And so he joins Magneto, and then while this is going on, I really like Colossus here. Once he joins Magneto, he's not fully on board with Magneto killing 1,000 people. We don't get to see him voice any objections. In fact, he's not even in the room when Magneto does that. But then later on, he's kind of the middle ground between the extremist of Magneto and the extremist of Professor X. They're both on opposite ends of the spectrum. There we go. Opposite ends of the spectrum, and then Colossus is right there in the middle. I need a third hand to show. Anyway, but Colossus is over here saying, like, the way of Charles Xavier does not work for me, but Magneto going out here killing people, that's also not great, because Colossus is kind of responsible for the other thing that's notable that happens in this book, and that is Charles Xavier says, I have had it with Magneto. I'm sick and tired of this happening. We have to go up there. We have to put a stop to him one way or another. And pretty much everyone is saying, that's not a very good idea. And he says, I don't care. We're doing this. And so he puts on his little Shi'ar walking costume, and then they go up there, and then Wolverine, like an idiot, tries to attack Magneto. And I'd like to remind you something that you probably know. Wolverine has a whole lot of metal in his body. And so Magneto, he basically rips all of the adamantium out of Wolverine. It nearly kills him. And then Charles Xavier mind wipes Magneto right there. That is the big thing that this big crossover is known for. And again, I feel like they had a lot of these ideas because at this time, the X-Men writers and artists, they would all go to a big yearly retreat and they would throw out ideas. For example, I believe Peter David jokingly said, what if Magneto ripped all of the metal out of Wolverine's body? And then they all looked at him and said, that's a really good idea. And Peter David was like, no, I was joking. But they did it anyway. So they have to have something like that they're working towards. They come up with these ideas and they say, okay, how do we get from point A to point B? So you have to have Magneto do something hostile because he sees the people of Earth doing something hostile when really they were just trying to keep him out and he didn't want to be on Earth. So you would think that'd be a win-win, but then he has to go and get other mutants to live with him. Anyway, this all leads to Professor X mind-wiping Magneto, which that's going to be a big part of the Onslaught saga, which is not the next crossover. I'm pretty sure, well, there's Blood Ties, obviously, which is a smaller one. And then I want to say you've got Age of Apocalypse, which is a big one, and then Onslaught, and then after that you've got like Operation Zero Tolerance. But this is kind of the seeds of the Onslaught storyline. But I really like this story overall. I was surprised how much I liked it because I was looking at this thinking like, okay, this is just going to be a gigantic storyline where we're going to have all of X-Factor and all of X-Force teaming up with both teams of X-Men, and they're just going to be like 40 different characters here, and about 5 of them are going to actually have something important to do. But that's not what they did. I really like the way that they did this crossover. I wish that they did something like this more often. You have something like The Fall of the Mutants where there was through lines kind of connecting these books, but you could read the New Mutants, Fall of the Mutants stuff by itself, and you didn't have to read the Uncanny X-Men stuff or the X-Factor stuff. And that's kind of what we've got going on here, and I like that quite a bit. Let's see, I feel like there was something else I wanted to talk about. Yes, Professor Xavier. He is acting like this is kind of going to be a suicide mission when they go up to Avalon because they really have no reason to suspect that they're going to make it back. If Magneto is the one keeping this gigantic space station up in the air and then they kill him or get rid of him somehow, they have no way of getting back to Earth. And when they do get back to Earth, it's very dicey and they spend most of the issue like, okay, the plane's falling apart, what do we do? But I believe this story would have been better if Charles Xavier had died, or at least we thought he died, because this book kind of ends with Magneto not dead. They all know that he's not dead, but definitely incapacitated for a while. Like, I want to say it's late 90s before Magneto is fully back to being back. But this book, I think, would have been a really interesting turning point for all of the X-Men books if Charles Xavier was somehow also incapacitated. And then we could have had a new era where the Acolytes are now being led by a new guy, Exodus, and then the X-Men can be led by Cyclops. And we can kind of see how are the X-Men going to survive without their father figure that they basically had for the last 30 years. This was hyped as being the big 30-year anniversary of the X-Men. And yes, there was a period where he was in space and he wasn't there helping them, and it was Magneto, but we knew that he was still alive. So this would have been really interesting if they did something kind of like what they did with Avengers vs. X-Men, where they kill off Charles Xavier and they take Magneto off the board, and now we get to see what the next generation is going to do now that these two guys are gone. Are they going to continue doing the same thing that Charles Xavier did? Are they going to kind of take the school in a different direction? We're no longer going to fight crime as superheroes. We're just going to focus on training these mutants. This would have been right before Generation X got started. I forgot about the Phalanx Covenant. That was another kind of small crossover event, and I don't remember where that fits in the crossovers of the 90s, but this would have been a really interesting time to really turn the X-Men status quo on its head, because this is when Wolverine leaves the X-Men for a period of time. He goes off to try and figure himself out now that he no longer has the adamantium. This is where he and everyone else finds out that he actually has bone claws underneath his metal, and that's something that, if you look at the Barry Windsor Smith Weapon X stuff from Marvel Comics Presents, we were told that his claws basically resulted from them accidentally pumping too much adamantium in his body, so it's kind of an excess that just came out and kind of formed claws. That doesn't really make any sense. I actually like the idea of having bone claws better than these are just claws that formed randomly whenever they were pumping adamantium onto his skeleton. So I like this little retcon here, and so he's got to go and figure himself out. Excalibur around this time, this was a big turning point for them. We get like one issue of Excalibur here, but they change locations. They're no longer at the Lighthouse. Most of the members of Excalibur are now gone, but it would have been really interesting if we could have used this as an opportunity for, okay, the reason that Nightcrawler says we need to change the way we do things, we need to try and be better, is Professor Xavier's gone, and now we have to do things in honor of his memory. And then X-Force, I'm pretty sure shortly after this, Cable is going to leave X-Force for good. I don't know exactly when that happens, but this could have been the time that they did that, and say, like, all the X-Men books are just going to be very different now that Charles Xavier is no longer the one holding the torch. I think that would have been interesting. Since they took Magneto off the board, it would have been good if they did the same thing with Charles Xavier. They didn't do that, and I think the story is still fine with them not doing that, but I think that would have been interesting. So anyway, those are my very lengthy thoughts on Fatal Attractions. I quite like this book a lot more than I thought I would. So I hope that you guys liked this video, and if you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will be back later in the week with some other videos. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.